Well, one was John Mark.
Oh, say that.
I mean, Mark is obviously one, but yes, John Mark. And I know we keep going over this, but it's just something that we have to just keep rehearsing so that we know it. So what are the synoptic gospels?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And which disciple was Mark actually related to? And what was his relation to that disciple?
Was it Peter?
He was not related to Peter. It was another disciple that he was related to. And in scripture, I'll give you the second part. He was called either his cousin or his nephew.
Philip. Was it Philip?
No.
I don't think I'm understanding the question.
You not understand. Which disciple was Mark related to? Actually related to, as far as family.
One of the,
Mr. May, do you remember this one?
was it one of the 12 disciples? That he
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Was it Paul?
No, it wasn't Paul.
You kept using two people's names, and I got when I wrote them down, I got confused.
He worked with Paul at first. So and then they split because of Barnabas. There we go. Yes.
Gotcha.
Well, I get some candy, don't I? Get a prize?
Yeah, you get some candy later.
No, somebody asked if they was part of the 12, and you said yes.
Yeah,
That's
but
what everybody.
Do what?
Someone asked were
I
they part of
didn't.
the 12, and you said yes. So that threw the whole class off.
Right, because I said that I had asked, was it part of the 12? And I was trying to think, but what Barnabas wasn't part of the 12, was he?
No.
He worked with Paul, but was he part of the original 12 disciples?
No, ma'am.
Okay, I guess I messed that question up.
But that's all right. You gave enough information at the end. I got it.
Thank you. Okay, so who was Mark's historical audience? Who was he writing to?
Romans, Gentiles.
Yes, go ahead, missionary.
Okay.
And Mark was a disciple of which apostle?
Paul.
That was Peter.
Peter.
Okay, Peter.
That's what I thought in that last question. I thought it was a trick question. Elder Tami. That's why I said Peter.
When you said who he was related to?
Yes, I
Because
thought
he referenced him as his son. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I just thought you was being like Elder Camille trying to slip us up.
Nope. Not trying to slip you up.
Don't do that.
So what is the term intercalation also called? We talked about this last week.
Sandwich
stories.
Yes, sandwich stories. Do you remember an example of a sandwich story we talked about last week? The two examples.
The bleeding woman and the dead girl.
Yes.
The little girl.
And what number actually linked both of them? That was symbolic
12.
for that 12.
12.
Absolutely representing. Y'all kind of remember what we went over last week, so that's a good thing. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we're gonna start, it starts in the section titled Son of God, if you got a chance to read. The phrase Son of God marks a frame or inclusio around the entire gospel. So this is how Mark frames this gospel by framing it as Jesus is presented as the Son of God. And he provides another, and this is another large example of Mark's use of irony. In Mark 1:1, the very beginning of this gospel, it says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark tells us clearly here that Jesus is God's son. And throughout Mark, it appears, it's ironic that demons recognize Jesus as the Son of God. All of these people recognize Jesus as the Son of God, but not his own disciples. In the end, as Jesus dies, the only person that ever confesses Jesus as the Son of God in Mark is the Roman centurion. And that is found in Mark 15, verses 33 through 39. So when we think about the Son of God, does anybody have any thoughts on why it would be important for a Roman to confess that Jesus is the Son of God in the gospel according to Mark, rather than his own disciples here?
Okay.
Anybody? Well, I did a little research, and I found out that the Romans were very familiar with the Son of God. So Mark had to know this about his audience, that they were familiar with the term, the Son of God. So if we go back into a little background of the Roman Empire, it's really very interesting how all of this transpired. The Roman Empire cast a vast shadow over the world of the New Testament, and the ways in which imperialism shaped the writings of the New Testament cannot be overstated. So the purpose of this, it had a very great purpose for him to put it in the very first part, the Son of God. He was writing to the Romans, and he knew that this would strike a chord with them. So when we think about imperialism, imperialism is a state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of their other territories and peoples. So this is something that Rome grew from just a tiny little village to this vast empire. America in many ways is also an imperial nation and empire. Many are proud to demonstrate their patriotism even in churches where some worship services seem to honor the American flag just as much as they honor God. But being proud of your country is one thing, but how many times do we stop to think how much this perceived freedom costs not just Americans, but those around the world? What happens when you realize that the consumption of your so-called blessed nation may be fueling oppression, suffering, and poverty for others? So this is the point where we are as far as this comparison is really showing how an empire like America and the consumerism and the consumption and how other countries perceive us as being very wasteful compares to those that they have dominion over, or those that are suffering because of the consumption of that nation. So just to frame it, in our world, over 1 billion people lack access to clean water. And every second a child dies of hunger and 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 100 million children are denied basic education, and 40% of people in our world lack basic sanitation. However, we as Americans, we spend more annually on trash bags than nearly half the other world does on all of their goods. So this is the reality of an empire. The empire creates this facade of peace and security and prosperity, all the while perpetuating suffering for other parts of the world, because many of our goods and services that we use come from other parts of the world. And those people, they live in dire poverty so that we can live the way that we live. So this is no different from what was going on with the Roman Empire. The realities regarding an empire makes us take a closer look at the historical context of the New Testament and how the Roman Empire had a major influence on the characters and writers of the Gospels, Acts, Epistles, and the Apocalypse. The authors of the New Testament and contemporary American Christians are faced with the task of living faithfully in the midst of an empire. Many consider the Roman Empire one of the greatest civilizations in history. But what do we actually see from the Gospel's author's perspective? One of the earliest figures that's mentioned in the New Testament is Caesar Augustus. And the New Testament makes reference to him. He was the emperor during the time of Jesus's birth. We have any questions or concerns so far about that much? Any comments? So a little more about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a primarily polytheistic civilization, and that means that people recognize and worship multiple gods and goddesses. Despite the presence of monotheistic religions within the empire, such as Judaism and early Christianity, the Roman Empire was okay with people that they conquered practicing their own religions to a certain extent. So what I also found out about the Romans, that to build from this tiny village to go to this vast empire, they had like over 500 years of uninterrupted war. And Rome grew from being an obscure village to the ruling empire of the world. The Roman people were tired of war, including civil war, by all of these that were vying for power during this time. So by the time Caesar Augustus came into power, he succeeded in exterminating his opponents in 30 BC and became the first emperor of Rome. Caesar Augustus was a ruler that gave the facade of ruling in peace and maintaining harmony while taking care of the Roman citizens. Although he mainly was concerned about and provided for only 3 groups of Romans, which were the senators and the equestrians, the citizens of Rome, and the soldiers of the Roman military. Doing some background, it was really interesting that after the soldiers, they were really the veterans there. They were really set up for life. They were given territory and land and good jobs after they served in these Roman armies. And the senators and equestrians, or the wealthy people, they really benefited from Caesar being in charge. So his approach to leadership gained him popularity in Rome because he took care of these groups. The senators and equestrians, that class enjoyed great wealth from the purse of the conquered people. The only way for Rome to erect their buildings and to grow and acquire the huge amounts of grain needed to feed its population so generously, because it was estimated that 250,000 men were given a portion of grain that would feed about 670,000 men. And the way that they were able to finance this was through heavy taxation of the conquered territories. So Rome became the indirect rulers of Judea around 63 BCE, before Common Era. And the heavy taxation of the Roman government left the majority in poverty, as most still paid tithes and offerings as well. So in order to keep control of the Galilean and Judean people, Julius Caesar, which was Caesar Augustus's father, and the Senate, they installed Herod as king. Herod expanded the temple in Jerusalem to be more grandiose and Hellenistic Roman in style. And he also imposed a sacrifice that the priest would give on behalf of Rome and the emperor. He had whole cities named to give reverence to Caesar, as well as imperial temples and fortresses to reinforce Roman control. Another fact is that Roman people, they enjoyed excess, but they also enjoyed entertainment. So excess and entertainment was what really drove them. And their entertainment was often brutal and deadly, such as gladiator games and chariot races, which became known as bread and circuses. So a popular Roman poet actually wrote that two things the people anxiously desire, bread and circuses. The government kept the Roman populace happy by distributing free food and staging huge spectacles. So the man that was in power of this empire, Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus, previously known as Octavian, became emperor in 31 BCE after a period of political unrest following the murder of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. The Roman Republic was in the midst of civil war when he took the throne. Caesar Augustus ruled in the footsteps of his surrogate father, Julius, who was deified or declared a god after his death. After the end of the Civil War, Caesar was celebrated as a hero, a great savior that ushered in peace. Whenever the great deeds of Augustus were proclaimed, they were presented with the Greek term evangelion, which is translated good news or gospel. Although Octavian did not desire to be known as the dictator, the Senate found that the name Augustus, which actually means worthy of veneration and worship, would be the way to express his unique status and authority, and he eventually became the object of worship throughout the entire empire. It was not just his name that gave Augustus this divine status, but also that his father had been divinized after his death, which meant that Augustus would now have ground for claiming the title Son of God. But God still used all of this to fulfill prophecy and send his beloved Son and the true Savior and Prince of Peace to the world. So now we go into the new king. At the time when the New Testament was written, the entire civilized world, with the exception of little known kingdoms of the Far East, was under the domination of Rome. So the entire civilized world was under Rome's rule. From the Atlantic Ocean to the west of the Euphrates River and the Red Sea on the east, and from the Rhone, I'm probably messing these names up, the Danube, the Black Sea, the Caucasus Mountains on the north to the Sahara on the south, stretched one vast empire under the headship and dictatorship of the emperor, called both King and Augustus in the New Testament. The Roman Empire was the human political entity that God used to prepare the world for the birth of the Messiah and the spread of the gospel. So now we get into the Son of God. So it's no wonder that Mark chose the very words to start off his gospel in Mark 1:1. This was a narrative and a title that the Roman, his audience, would have been very familiar with, considering that they have worshiped Augustus, the emperor, in this exact manner. In fact, the description of Caesar Augustus as being a symbol of peace and the Son of God was very similar to the true gospel message of Christ. No other human confesses Jesus as the Son of God besides the Roman centurion in Mark. And God the Father also uses the title Son of God in a few places in Mark. In Mark, the first chapter, verse 10, at Jesus' baptism, God says, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." In this passage, Mark also tells us that the heavens are open, which is a Greek word schizo. That's also in your book. So that word is unique to Mark's gospel, but it is used regularly in the Old Testament, which describes the opening of the heavens, and to describe the Lord's coming by rending the heavens. In Isaiah 64:1, this word is used, and also in Psalms 18, verse 9. At the baptism, the Father shows that he has torn open the sky to come deliver his people. Jesus's arrival is a sign that the heavens have been opened, and Mark uses the same verb for the rending of the temple veil in chapter 15, verse 38, just before the centurion confesses Jesus, and says that this man was the Son of God. So this word schizo is also very symbolic here. It describes Jesus' coming, and then also when the temple rent, it being open so that all people could be accepted by God. Any questions so far or comments? Okay. The Father speaks again in the middle of the book at the Mount of Transfiguration. And that's in Mark 9:1. Jesus' baptism and his transfiguration are closely linked. So if we take a look at page 153 of the book, like the second paragraph toward the bottom, it really kind of shows us how Mark is links the baptism and the transfiguration, because really we probably wouldn't think that these things would be greatly linked, but the format of Mark is kind of set up very similarly in both of these scenarios. It says at the bottom, the Father speaks again in the middle of the book at the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus' baptism and his transfiguration are closely linked. In both events, there is a voice from heaven. In both places, the Father says, "This is my beloved Son." In both, there is a reference to Elijah. In chapter 1 of Mark, John is dressed like an Elijah. And in chapter 9, Elijah himself appears, and shortly after Jesus tells his disciples that John is Elijah. After the transfiguration, Jesus goes down from the mountain and immediately encounters a boy possessed with an unclean spirit, just as Jesus encounters the devil right after his baptism. In Mark, these two events are at the beginning of the two phases of Jesus' ministry. Each of these passages discusses the connection of Jesus with John. And when we put the parallels between the baptism and the transfiguration together with Mark's use of the phrase Son of God, we get this sketch of the book as a whole. So really, the Son of God is the central point of the whole book. And the way that it is set up from Mark, if you can see this table I made, Son of God, Mark 1, chapters 1 through 8, verse 21. We go through the baptism, schizo, when the heavens rent, the reference to John, God proclaiming that Jesus is his beloved Son. And then after that, after the baptism, he encounters a demon, and then the befuddlement of his disciples. Similarly, in Mark, starting chapter 8, verses 22, we see that Peter declares Jesus as the Christ. This is after and then the transfiguration. And then we see a reference to Elijah again at the transfiguration. God calls him his beloved Son. There is an encounter with the demon after that. And then the centurion confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, and then schizo happens. So Mark's, the format of it is very similar, and it repeats a pattern. The book is divided almost exactly in half. Each half begins with what the Father tells us from the beginning, that Jesus is the Son of God. And it goes almost in order to prove that, and it goes through almost the same, his ministries go through the same similar situations. So the inclusio, the frame, or what is called bookends, it really goes into repetition of the same language in Mark. And it tells us that there may be a chiasm in the book as a whole. And that word chiasm refers to a sequence of elements of a book, sentence, or verse, paragraph, chapter, or even a book which are then repeated and developed, but in reverse order. So we see that in Mark. The chiasm in Mark is with the baptism and the transfiguration. Although the events are happening, they're kind of happening in the scripture in reverse order. So they kind of label them like, if you've read it, like A, B, C, D, E. And it explains it that way, as far as starting at the baptism, when he split the heavens and God declared that he was the Son of God. In the transfiguration, he declared him as his beloved son. So at the baptism, we find that Jesus is tested in the wilderness. And that's in chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. In transfiguration, we find it in reverse order, that Jesus is then tested in the temple. And that's in chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. So we see he's tested by Satan in the wilderness. And then in the temple, again, we see that he is tested. In the baptism scenario, we see that in chapters 4, verses 1 through 9, that he goes through the sower parable, the parable of the sower. And in the transfiguration, in verses 12, 1 through 11, we see that it's the vineyard parable. So that's how these two are closely linked. In the baptism, we see the stilling of the storm. That is in chapter 6, verses 45 through 52, when the disciples were all afraid and Jesus was asleep and he stilled the storm. And then in chapters 9, verses 14 through 29, we see the exorcism of the possessed boy. So that is how they're kind of linking this, these scenarios in Mark. He's confirmed by God at the transfiguration, as far as God is saying, this is my beloved son. And then in Peter, at the baptism, it's Peter's confession that you are the Christ. And then to end it, Jesus, after the baptism scenario, he predicts his death concerning the passion. So he's saying all these things which the disciples don't really understand at the time. But then in the transfiguration, at the end of that, it's the actual death and the splitting of the veil and the confession by the Roman centurion. Roman centurion. So in both of the structure outlines in Mark 8:31 through 33 stands out as the center, where Jesus predicts his own suffering and death as a way of explaining what it means to be the Christ. So through all of this, what is Mark really trying to tell us? Through both scenarios, the climax in his writings is the death of Christ. So, I mean, if we look at that from a perspective, if that's the climax of the book of Mark, so what is that really saying? If he was a man of action, his whole purpose was to come and die. And as his followers, we also have to die to self. Any questions about chiasm or how Mark is set up so far? Any comments? I really found it interesting because I never really stopped to think that the theme of Mark was set up in this manner, whether it was deliberate or if it was just, that's how it was done through Holy Spirit. But the way that his writings go almost in order in both halves and tell the same story, just different scenarios, is really powerful in a way. And it's also very, I don't know, it just kind of makes you think, like, wow.
Well, yeah, and you begin to really see the way that Romans wrote.
Right.
It's you really do the literary criticism of Mark. It's very what's the word? Not deep. Well, it's detailed we don't think it's detailed because of how quick
Motion
he
detected
tells
as
the
Exactly.
story.
Exactly.
But it's very I can't think of the word that I want to use. Particular, I guess, when you look at the
I know
structure.
what you're trying to say. Yeah, it's very yeah.
I want to say, I
Organized
can't think of the word.
almost. I want to say organized almost.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say organized, mechanical. It's just real,
Mechanical. Yeah.
yeah. And we never really think about that, especially when you. I encourage everybody to read in the book about inclusios and intercalations, because those are very important when reading the book of Mark, and you begin to see the pattern of how Mark writes and the purpose of his writing. Like you said, he's a swift writer, and so his high climax was, the death of Jesus, and the way that he, stacks it. It's really interesting. So yeah.
And I also found it interesting the part about Caesar Augustus. I never knew that background about him. Like he was actually deemed like the son of God, so they were already kind of familiar with that.
Yeah, the term son of God was very popular. You see it in a lot of their writings, and it doesn't mean the son of God like we think the son of God. It's the son
I'm
of
not
the
saying
God. Yeah,
right.
I'm just saying the son of the gods, plural,
Right.
actually. Like when you read the book of Daniel, the original, what is it? I think it's like Daniel chapter 3, when they were in the, in the fiery furnace, and they said, look, it looks like the son of God or whatever. And the original translation of that is the son of the gods, not son of God. It was changed in the King James version to say the son of God, to make us think that it was the son of God in the furnace.
Like
You know
the
what I'm
only
saying?
God.
Yeah, so the term son of God is very popular amongst the Romans, and you see in a lot of their writings. And it's always plural, gods. Yeah. And they thought, Julius Caesar was the son of the god or son of God, So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Caesar Augustus. That's interesting to me. Yeah. So
I have a question.
Okay.
From what Camille said, Elder Camille, excuse me. So if that was changed, the tense was changed so that we would think that they were talking about the Son of God, then what is it? Should we actually now look at that scripture as if they were not looking? I mean, they were not seeing the Son of God. Then if the tense is changed and their meaning behind it was a little different, you understand what I'm saying? Like, or do
Yeah,
you
instead of
I
asking?
think that they worship idols. So to them, they didn't have just one God. They had, many. They really worship all of the Greek gods plus some. So to them, their deity wasn't just like they weren't just it wasn't just one. It was polytheistic instead of monotheistic. So
Right.
So what you're saying is they're
you're talking about Daniel, Lindsay, right? You're talking about
right.
Daniel.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. So yeah, that's the original term. That's the original translation of that. So yeah, you want to think of it as sons of the gods. They didn't know anything about son of God. It wasn't revealed to them. Why would it be revealed to the pagans before it was revealed to Israel? Like Israel
Right.
didn't even know nothing about God at that time. So yeah, you want to look at it as the son of the gods.
So what you're saying is even in that, it doesn't take away from what's being said. It gives us an understanding that the king didn't have that revelation.
Right.
That's all. That's what it's doing. So even in
Right.
reading it, it's not like, oh my God, it just changed the whole text, where it really didn't. What it changed is, because in my mind, I've always thought like, wow, like this man really got this revelation that Christ was in this fire with them. And
Right.
so when you put it that way, it's like, okay, great. He did not, but he said it according to his capacity of thinking, oh, it's the son of the
Right.
gods. That makes sense. Like it
Right.
helped the text now make more sense rather than taking away from it or changing the concept that if I ever teach it again, it's like, oh, I gotta completely change. It's like, no, it's just now you understand where the man's mindset was at the time.
Right. Yeah, because once you understand culture,
Yep.
it makes sense.
Yep.
And so it doesn't take away that the fact that it was God in there. It was actually God,
Right.
you know, it doesn't take away the fact. It just adds another viewpoint of the king looking, or whoever was looking in there and saying,
Nebuchadnezzar.
that's the son of the God. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar was looking here and it was like the son of the gods. That's all he
Yeah.
knew was most of the gods. You know what I'm saying?
He knew it was
Yeah.
somebody.
You said what?
Exactly. She
I
said
said he knew it was somebody.
somebody.
He just could not. He didn't have the capacity to know like this was really the true and living God. But it kind of compelled him to know something just happened here. Like
Right,
this is not
It was
normal. This is
mysterious.
supernatural.
Right, something mysterious, something magical is going on, and you know,
Right.
so yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy because I preached that text 50 times. 50,000. It was
Yeah.
it's one of my favorite, but and I've always been blown away how he had that revelation and nobody else did. Like, wow.
I thought that too. Like, how did he get that? He didn't even believe it.
Fan.
So that's another point I thought that was really good. So it kind of brings it, for me, it brings it together even more, knowing a little more of the background and what they thought. So like Elder Camelia was saying, if we can continue to dig into inclusio and intercalations to see exactly how this was set up as far as the writings for the New Testament, it will also help us with a deeper understanding of the gospel messages. And even the term gospel was widely used then, or good news. It was used in reference to, so all of this was not like something that was just new and made up. They had some type of knowledge of it, even if it wasn't in the right context, for them to be able to grasp the message when it actually came and the truth actually came. So also the next section in the book that starts on page 156 describes Jesus as being God's messenger. This is also a big theme in Mark. So after God tells us that this is his son in Mark, Mark begins his gospel with a quotation from Isaiah 40, which says, "The voice crying out in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight." And this is in Mark chapter 1, verses 2-3. This comes from the prophecy about the coming redemption of Israel from Babylonian exile. It is the only direct quotation that Mark gives, although Jesus quotes the Old Testament a lot in the gospel. Mark points to Jesus as being the one to fulfill hope, and this gospel is the good news of deliverance from exile. The other theme in Mark is he describes him as a divine warrior. So this whole theme is found in Isaiah chapters 40-66. Return from exile is the big theme of those chapters. And Isaiah not only promises return from exile, but also the coming of the divine warrior. So in chapter 49, verse 24, Isaiah talks about taking the prey of the mighty man. And Mark is putting Jesus in the place of the divine warrior that's going to take the prey of the mighty man, and tells us that Jesus comes to deliver Israel from the strong man Beelzebub and leading his followers along a way. So this is something that Mark talks about a lot, the divine warrior. which is also showing Jesus as a man of action. And he's come with a purpose and leading his people. The Romans would have been very familiar with that because they had strong armies and war. And the way that Isaiah describes,
I mean, you said at one point they was in war for 500 years.
500 years. I mean, they had power over almost the entire earth.
Right. That's who they are.
That's who they are. So they were looking for the divine warrior, the one that can really come and but this is in the Old Testament. So Mark's use of this has a lot of symbolic meaning. The way that Isaiah describes, just as Yahweh had promised to deliver Israel out of Babylon on a path they did not know, the warrior would lead his blind followers along a way that they did not understand, arriving in Jerusalem. So he talks about the way of the Lord in many different ways throughout Mark. His opening quotation not only links the ministry of Jesus to the prophecies of Isaiah, but highlights the crucial theme of the way of the Lord. Mark commonly refers to the way, especially in the second half of the book. So it's often referred to, like he'll say, like on the road that, one example is on the road that Jesus and his disciples were traveling. It is also used if Jesus sends the crowd, when Jesus sent the crowd home without food, they said they will faint on the way. Peter confesses Jesus on the way, and Jesus asks what the disciples were discussing on the way when he overhears them talking about which one of them is the greatest. So it's always kind of pointing to the way. And the way at other times is an image of a way of teaching or a way of life in Mark. Jewish leaders flatter Jesus by saying that he teaches people the way of God in truth. And that's found in chapter 12, verse 14. When Mark's readers find themselves following in the way of Jesus, it is filled with symbolic content. It is the way out of exile, the way of Exodus, the way through the wilderness, the way towards the promised land, a victory march behind the divine warrior. So I know we can relate to that part of it because we know him as being the way, the truth, and the life. Also in the beginning of Mark. You have something to say?
One thing, one thing with the way, when you begin to see that in the epistles, because they call those who follow Jesus Christ followers of the way.
Of the way, yeah.
Yeah. So it makes sense. It would keep that theme of
Right.
Disarm system now. System disarm.
Yeah, so that's really good that they continue that as well, because it's like the way. And we all hear that because we know, like, the way of the Lord, his way is narrow, like wide is the way of destruction, but narrow is the way. So yeah, that's a good point. But Mark also quotes Malachi in the opening quotation. It's not entirely from Isaiah. It says, I send my messenger before your face. And that's found in Malachi 3:1. Behold, I'm going to send my messenger and he will clear the way before me. So Isaiah and Malachi are similar in this way. They point to Christ being the way, but Malachi warns that the messenger will come into his temple and he will refine Judah, and especially the sons of Levi, as silver and gold are refined in the fire. So it was really the original meaning of that prophecy was about exile from Babylon. But then Malachi goes a step further and he's saying that, no, it's also a warning that the messenger will come into his temple and And it tells us, I believe it was Exodus, that they are supposed to listen to the messenger that God sends. But he's not going to only come to save and deliver them, that he's coming and he's going to refine Judah, especially the sons of Levi. So who are the sons of Levi? The priests, the ones that are in charge of the priestly duties. He's going to come and refine them in the fire. So Mark emphasizes the central importance of the temple and shows that Jesus comes to purify and judge Israel in order to save her. So when Mark uses the term messenger, it's also irony here. Behind Malachi 3:1 stands Exodus 23, which warns Israel to obey the angel or messenger that Yahweh sends to lead them to the promised land. And this highlights Israel's hope for a new Exodus, but with a twist. Like I was saying before, in Exodus 23 and Malachi, they are about Israel's faithlessness. And although they are the same in that manner, they're also different. Exodus promises that the Lord will lead them despite their sin. But Malachi warns that he's coming to judge and purge Israel. When Israel accuses Yahweh of dereliction of duty, since he has not dealt with evildoers, Yahweh's response is that after sending a messenger to prepare his way, he will indeed come, but his coming may not inaugurate the blessing his people expect, since they themselves may well be the ones who are purged in judgment. Malachi turns the promise of Exodus 23 into a threat for Israel. So I don't know, Elder Camille, if you had anything else to add to that part of it, how Exodus and Malachi are related here in Mark.
No, I was just sitting here thinking, when you do the work and look at Exodus 23 and Malachi, it's very interesting. I love to do that observance. So yeah, you guys, when you get a chance, just look at it, just read it, and let us know what you think. The next class or something. What you think about that comparison.
Yeah, it's very interesting how they both kind of start out the same, but then Malachi takes it a step further.
Right.